Welcome to Saturday's Warrior, where we talk all things BYU, Big 12, and realignment. But we've been really heavy on the realignment lately because we've been doing a segment going around the ACC, talking to each of the member schools, doing kind of a deep dive on their perspectives on realignment and how things may shake out for their schools. And so tonight, we will be talking about the U in the ACC. And no, I'm not talking about that U. They're staying in the Big 12. We're talking to Rock and Rant, a contributor to the College Football Mafia. Welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be with you tonight.
I really appreciate it. Before we get started, if you like talking realignment, please like the video and subscribe to the channel so you can catch all of our conversations around the ACC. Go catch all those that we've already posted and see the new ones as they come out. Rock and Rant, talking Miami is an interesting one. And I say that every time I have one of these conversations, which goes to show, even though all these schools in the ACC are kind of in the same boat, you look at just how different each of their situations really are when you kind of look at the nuances that each of them is facing. But before we get into all that and Miami and everything, I kind of want to get your take on realignment, a big picture on that, and the landscape, the ever-changing landscape of college athletics at this point.
This week alone has been a lifetime, right? And when it comes to the world of college football, from the settlement on the cases to to announcing EA games and the gameplay and the excitement around that, from the bad to the good. So it's I don't know, this season of college football realignment, these episodes seem to be the craziest so far. I guess that's probably from my perspective, being out on the ACC, the guys on the main stage. I know for others it might be different if you just went through finally getting into the Big 12 after years of trying to, or coming back to the Big 12 after leaving. Everyone has their own sort of special version of what season of craziness has been their favorite or least favorite. For me, it's like both right now. It's a little bit of heaven and hell, the excitement of hoping that we get out of the ACC, a conference that most Miami fans haven't really liked forever, separate and apart from our underachievement over the last several years that I'm sure the ACC has not been thrilled with, but also not having a certainty about the future, and if you have a confidence about it.
Yeah, I mean, you said it right there. All the craziness, and I think that's interesting because I hadn't heard that before. Though you mentioned Miami has had an issue with the ACC for a long time. Why has that been, and what have those issues been? I don't know if I was aware of that.
Yeah, I would say I'm sure the ACC has not been thrilled that Miami didn't come into the conference and perform the way Miami had beforehand. And as a fan, of course, we're of the same mindset. No one's harder on their own teams generally than their own fans, and Miami's fan base is definitely in that same boat, if not probably excelling at self-criticism and frustration over things over the years. But from a clearly biased fan-central point of view, we have always felt, and I speak for the fan base, though I don't really have the right to do so, but I would say generally the consensus has been that it's always been a Tobacco Road conference, and it didn't matter that Miami came in and or Florida State or any others that came in later. If the calls never seem to go your way, again, sometimes that's a degree of bias. And then sometimes there's the letters from the ACC saying, yeah, we blew it, which we tend to get a lot of those. We're good enough at self-fulfilled damages by not taking in a game, which of course became the meme last year. But whether it's football or basketball, even as Miami rose up and became a program that mattered as well with the Final Four run last year, just hasn't been. It's felt like you're in a different division within the league, and it wasn't about the Atlantic versus the Coastal. It was the who was there first along with the Tobacco Road OG teams versus everybody else, where questionable calls always seem to go that way. Again, could be a perception, but there's no love lost from Miami fans for the ACC before this whole carnival began.
So I mean, I know where the College Football Mafia guys come down on a lot of these things, and I differ from them a bit in terms of, I'm not necessarily excited to see another old, long-standing conference go by the wayside if that does in fact happen to the ACC. I do, if it does, I certainly want to see the Big 12 benefit. But based on what you're saying, it sounds like Miami's not necessarily on the best of terms with ACC anyway. How do they feel about the potential pending doom of the conference? I mean, are they worried about it? Do they want to keep it together? Or are they, really okay with that?
The fan base doesn't care. The administration, Dan Radakovich, who became the Miami athletic director a couple of years back, who came over from Clemson, is a very seasoned athletic director, does political speak the best of anyone, the kind of athletic director that will tell you that there is no imminent change. We're not bringing Alonzo Highsmith on to be our GM today, because it's true. Today, we're not bringing him on to be the GM of the program, but next week there's a press announcement that Alonzo Highsmith is coming to join your program. That kind of speak, like very old school public speaking. So, all the words coming from that side, which have not been that frequent, another source of frustration probably for Miami fans, have been, we are proud members of the ACC, blah, blah, blah. True, not true. True until it's not true. Nice until somebody tells you not to be nice. That remains to be seen. The Miami fan base could care less about staying in the ACC. I'm sure there's some that do. Most of them are if they're preoccupied with the subject at all, which not everyone is. Not everyone's into the weeds to the degree that some of us have all gone down this rabbit hole are. For me, it's fascinating and has gotten me into a lot of great creators and opportunities like this. But for the most part, everyone wants to know who's focused on it at all is where are we going and how soon can we get out, and where will that landing spot be? Obviously, with Florida State being our main rival, Florida State may have fans split among that between Florida and us, depending upon the year and time and who's good. But for us, clearly Florida State as primary, our main focus, or mine at least, I'll speak for myself, is wherever we land, hopefully we land in one of the P2, that's the goal, and that the Florida State rivalry continues. And I think the Ford fans really wish we knew an hour ago, because it's both like one of the things people love to talk about the most and one of the things everyone's tired of talking about, right?
Yeah. So that's interesting perspective from Miami, that you feel like fans generally would like to end up alongside Florida State wherever they go. So Miami,
or at least making sure that if they wound up in two different conferences, like for example, right now, Florida and Florida State is two state schools, even though they're in different conferences, at a state government level, they are required to play every year. That doesn't really hold true for Miami and Florida State, though they have had a longer relationship. Miami played Florida State before Florida ever deigned to do so. Both brands were built on the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s on amazing games, right? Like whether you love either school, hate both schools, doesn't really matter. That's a fact. So we just hope that if they, the easiest way for that to continue is to go to the same conference. If that doesn't happen, and for whatever reason the two do get split, the way things all play out, just making sure that one of the out of conference games remains, that key game, which I'm assuming your fan base in particular can completely relate to, with the Holy War, which I've gotten, completely immersed in through friends over the last few months that I didn't really know about to the same degree before, but I've seen the nature of that from afar, and I respect rivalries like that. So ideally together, because it's the easiest way to keep the rivalry. If separated away, that one of the out of conference games, whether there are 2, 1, or 3 out of conference games for those conferences, remain in that rivalry. That's like first and foremost to me, at least.
Yeah, it seems that would be tough, just because they're already committed theoretically to still playing Florida, and then if like they ended up in the Big Ten, for example, that would only give them, because they're playing a 9 conference game schedule, right? And so that only gives them two additional ones. And would they really want to play that, 2 big time rivals? It seems like that might be difficult, which would be a casualty of realignment. We've seen a lot of rivalries torn apart from it.
For sure. And somewhat ironic, because one of the key things you assume and everyone talks about is that the networks are, they're looking at schools and where they're going from, from market coverage, and to some degree, the cable carriage that, you can get by going into a new state or a new market and getting an SEC network in a new state officially and all that. But they're also trying to get rivalries and matchups. And it would be, I think, anytime one of those key, rivalries goes away, Bedlam as an example, maybe not to the same degree, but for those schools, or at least for Oklahoma State, paramount rivalry that you just hate to see go. A game that even if I wasn't paying attention to those schools that much, I would pay attention to that game, right? When that game was playing, it was on a TV, just because you know how fierce that kind of rivalry is. So lots of winners and losers in all of this, and hopefully it comes to a wind down soon enough, but I don't think it is. I think we still have several years of this, and then 29, 30, when contracts come up again, who the heck knows what happens again.
Yeah, no, it's just been a snowball going downhill, right? And it just gets faster and faster instead of slowing down at all. It feels like it's just moving at a continually increasing pace. Okay, so you mentioned Miami would like to get out. So even though they've kind of sent mixed messages, they've kind of been playing nice. They've tried to say the right things. Seems like maybe they're hedging their bets in case the conference stays together. You're saying, if the opportunity comes along, Miami would like to get out, and they would like to be at that, kind of that Super 2 level up there, the Big Ten and SEC. So can you, let's start with the Big Ten. Can you make your case for Miami to get into the Big Ten? Why the Big Ten should consider Miami?
So from a culture and fit perspective, I would think that the Big Ten fits Miami better than the SEC as an example. Not that it doesn't fit. And part of that is just, Miami undergrad wise, as in South Florida, a lot of the undergrad students are from Chicago, the Northeast. They're the Northern. It's not like 75% of the undergrads at Miami are all from Miami. They're not. It's a more national school. There's certainly a disproportionate number of students from South Florida, but the alumni base is dispersed across the board. There's the athletic department, as a random example, was out here in Los Angeles, which is where I live, doing fundraising, doing meetings with key donors, several weeks ago. It's a stop, as is Chicago. So there's a fit there. Miami just recently became AAU. So although I don't know the degree that AAU and academics truly play a part when you're talking to your friends at Fox, it is a fit in that regard, having attained that status a couple of years back, or a year and a half ago, whatever it was, sometime around then. So it fits from that perspective. And there's just a lot of great historic rivalries there as well. Miami playing Nebraska back in the day, Miami and Ohio State, depending upon what Notre Dame does, ultimately continuing that rivalry in one form or another, even though it was cold and not played for a number of years because it was so heated and so hot. There's a lot of natural things, even one or two off games, the Ohio State versus Miami. You can see a lot of rivalries that would extend. And then the last thing probably, or it's just the geographic location of Miami for the Big Ten plays well for two reasons, right? Other than Ohio State, every other school, of course, recruits in Florida, but Ohio State's really the only one that has made a massive impact with some of the top 4-star, 5-star recruits that are coming out of Florida. It would give a lot of other schools in the Big Ten an additional lift, I think, to have a member school in South Florida, even if they were to get Florida State, right? Florida is like 8 hours drive across, from one end to the other. It's, covers a lot of states, maybe not in Big 12 country where the states are really big too, but relative to the East Coast and the South, it is a very large state. It's the third or fourth most populated state in the country. And it will give, those players another opportunity to have an occasional home game, a recruiting lift, but there's also a huge Big Ten alumni base in South Florida. So it gives those schools an opportunity when their teams are playing against Miami, from football to the other sports where those will probably happen more regularly, the opportunity to do things for alumni and boosters and, fill 10,000 seats at a stadium without them having to take a road trip. So there's a lot of pluses, I think, there. From an academic side all the way to the athletic side. And Miami is a research institution that is growing and has some programs that the Big Ten does not currently have. The Marine Science School, they have a burgeoning medical school. So there's a lot of fit there.
Yeah. So I remember looking at that, and I can't remember my source now. It's somewhere, and I've seen it quoted other places, but just showing a breakdown of where Big Ten alumni live in all the cities and stuff. And right up there near the top, amongst other Midwest towns, was Miami. And so definitely a big base there. And also, who wouldn't like to get out of the cold during some of those later games in the season and go down to Miami and play? The question is, does Miami want to go up to Minnesota in early November or something and play a game?
Miami does not have an awesome history of playing, great and cold, but it's more about when Miami's good, it doesn't matter, and when Miami's bad, it's a great excuse. It's not like in the Big East days, Miami wasn't going to go play Pitt and West Virginia and Boston College. Syracuse didn't matter because it was in a dome. In the days before then, Independence, a lot of those games were against schools in colder climates. But you know, if you just think about the way schedules are done, what are you going to have, one or two games in November where it's very cold potentially, if that's even still a thing as the temperatures keep kicking up a little bit over time. But yeah, they can have an excuse. Like, you can just get used to it, and winners try to figure out a way to get around everything. Also, the flip side, the Big Ten, wouldn't be surprised if they were to go to a Big Ten if the scheduling was very convenient, so that a lot of home games were later. So just for the purposes that you're talking about, it's a perfect away trip for cold weather schools to come down for their fan base. Now, who isn't living there, but might be traveling in from Michigan or Minnesota.
Yeah, that's true. Just selfishly, they might say, "Hey, you know what? It's going to benefit Miami. It's going to benefit us." So
Yeah, it's a little bit. It's a little bit of a wash, depending upon how a particular year and schedule breaks out.
Yeah, that's a good point. You also mentioned Notre Dame, which I think is an interesting one because I thought that would be a strong argument for adding Miami to the Big Ten because you're not, even though Notre Dame at the meantime is is insistent that they'll remain independent, and as long as they've got access to the playoff, which they still do, there's really no incentive for them to change that. But adding schools, because they already have a lot of their, especially with adding USC, they have most of their rivals. I feel like inside of the Big Ten already. Add Miami, that might be another incentive. But last year they did pass on adding Stanford, in which is a better academic institution, a better a bigger market than say the entire state of Oregon. But yet they still took Oregon because it was a bigger football brand. Now Miami has the benefit of both. It has a nice climate. It has the big football brand. It has the academics, and it has that rivalry component. Kind of seems like the best of both worlds. However, it does seem like Florida State is ahead in that, and you have to assume that with all they're doing to get out of the ACC, that they have to feel pretty good, you'd think, about their position and being able to get into one of the conferences. And as of late, you and I were talking offline about this, is that really, I mean, it's been going around for a while, but seems to be coming on really strong now that Florida State and Clemson to the Big Ten is what all the talk is. So how do you feel like Miami's chances of, even with all those points, the argument you laid out, how do you feel like Miami's chance of getting into the Big Ten are, or do you feel like it's still kind of an outside chance?
I mean, if you gave me $10 and I had to make a bet or I had to split it up, like, I would still be putting it on the Big Ten, whether it's the same timeline as Florida State and Clemson, if they both wind up going there, who have already taken a lot of measures to publicly raise their hand if they want to go. And with the court filings, maybe it's not, maybe it's a year difference. Who knows? I take all of that with all the information that gets out there with a grain of salt. I think there's some great reporters and great citizen journalists, for lack of a better term, YouTube creators who have developed amazing sources, and the things that they put out there could very well be right. And as a fan, a selfish fan, I wish Miami was taking public actions that signaled things that I believe are happening, and I'm pretty confident are happening in private. But it's frustrating to you as just the fan, you know, who's frustrated with your conference. You'd like to see public signs of that, if only to give you ammunition in the ever-ending troll war that rivals do upon each other on social media, right? I also, my background in professional world has been in the entertainment and media side, both in business affairs and a marketing PR side. So read too many contracts about content and rights and IP, and I've written too many press releases. And I also know very well that sometimes people give legitimate information to legitimate sources who then relay that to us, but they have an agenda or a reason, for that. I could, if you take the news today, which is quite possibly right, like I'm not even trying to dispose it from one of the better YouTube channels out there following conference realignment, a peek around the corner, that Florida State and Clemson are now the chalk to go to the Big Ten from the conversation. Yeah, I completely believe that is a very good possibility, a very likely possibility. No doubt whatsoever that happened. I would not be surprised or shocked. It would not be anything like that. But I could also, I know what I've done in the past, which is, well, let's put this out there to get them moving more, or to give ourselves more leverage in our negotiation, or to get somebody else moving more and kind of giving a gentle nudge to get their act together because we have other options. It's a lot of chess moves out there. The movie at the end of this, the Netflix series, when it's really all said and done, is going to be awesome when we find out what really did or didn't happen and how much of our fan fiction was fan truth. But it's frustrating. I certainly, because if Florida State and Clemson went to the Big Ten, and if they only went to 20, then you're like, what happens then? You have to wait years. Does it never happen? Is the Super League, Super Conference a thing at some point? I have a hard time imagining that either the Big Ten or the SEC is going to ultimately want a state like Florida for their competitor to have two premier brands and them only have one when it's all said and done. And though there are other schools there that could fit in, there's really just the three that are main, as much as UCF and USF are clearly on the rise and getting funded to really invest in their programs.
Great transition. You did all the hard work for me. So you mentioned the SEC. So let's go there and make the case for Miami to get into the SEC.
Clearly the geographics are a lot easier. It's a contiguous state. If you're going to have two schools in Mississippi and Alabama, where only one generally in those states, actually that's not fair for Alabama. Auburn's had a lot of great moments in history, but you have two schools in those states as an example. There's no reason why you couldn't have two schools in Florida. If you're afraid of competition of having Miami, who you're already recruiting against for most of the key programs in Miami, I don't know how much more you would be recruiting against Miami. I guess you could say that the SEC having Miami would give Miami another level of credibility and aura about the competition in that conference that maybe makes a difference for somebody who's on the edge. I think that would be a stronger argument personally 2 years ago, even 5 years ago. In the NIL era, I don't know that it's as much of an argument as long as your NIL program is on par with your competitors like that. And at least for the moment, Miami's NIL program is clearly one of the strongest ones in the country. Like Miami's all in this year spending money, whether 4 years from now that remains to be the same situation. If the results don't follow, that we'll see. But despite popular opinion, Nevin Shapiro and John Ruiz are actually not the money men at Miami. One of them has money, the other one never did. But there is a strong program there. So, it just adds for that conference, right? It adds more matchups. If all you have to do is go Miami versus Alabama, is that a game that people would want to see and tune into? I would think they would. Whether Miami gets their butt kicked or is competitive, it's Miami's a polarizing brand. Probably for most, you would agree with that. I think to some, there's a lot of other polarizing brands that you might see it from a slightly different side, but people watch things they don't like and they watch things they do like. So I think it just brings a lot of eyeballs to that conference and adds, another level of audience to what is already a dominating conference.
Yeah, you hit some major points there, and I want to go back to the other point you made about the Big Ten. Do they want to play defensively and say, hey, we don't want to leave them available for the Big Ten to scoop up. We want to go ahead and take them, play defense on our own state, and not let our major competitor, the Big Ten, get into our own backyard. But also, I've heard some people describe it, and you just said it's a big state. Miami's at a very different point, part of the state from Florida, and in many ways, it's almost like a different state. It's almost a different universe down there, and so I don't know how much that plays into recruiting with these recruits. I don't know exactly what it's in the pitches and what kids are concerned about these days, but you would think Miami's an attractive market for anybody. But there's that whole thing of, well, you don't want to tick off Florida because with the gentleman's agreement of not adding another school in state. Even if you can make the argument for it and it makes sense, they've shown now that even though much to the chagrin of Texas A&M, they went ahead and added Texas, but
Right.
Texas is such a huge brand. I think you can afford to tick off A&M. Can the SEC afford to tick off the Gators, and what kind of sway do the Gators have in that? That's my question.
Yeah. Or alternatively, I mean, that was always the chalk forever, right? That the Gators would block either Miami or Florida State from going, though, depending upon how far back in history you look, there are moments where it was rumored, like, way back when South Carolina ultimately joined the SEC, if I'm not mistaken, there were reports that Miami was given like 24 hours to accept at that time before they went to the Big East, and that didn't come to pass in that speed. Whether that's 100% fact or urban legend, I would have to have somebody research that a little bit more, but I do know that story exists out there in some form. The other part with Florida, in terms of blocking Florida State, will just go down the easier path and not make it my bias. I just can't imagine in a world where the Attorney General of the state of Florida is getting involved in trying to see the media contract from ESPN that the ACC has locked in the vault like it's nuclear codes, that they're going to be able to have the juice to go against the Attorney General and Governor should they want Florida State to get into the SEC for whatever reason, despite it being aligned with the evil ESPN of Disney fame. Like, I just don't know that they have that kind of juice to do that in an era when you're talking about $40 to $50 million in difference in potential revenue from one conference to another for a state institution over a gentleman's agreement that doesn't even match the bylaws, which require three quarters vote to gain membership. In a world where exactly what you said, Texas A&M, surprise, we're here. It doesn't really hold true. So, I would imagine from seeing things that the Florida State fan base probably is just so annoyed over everything that happened with the playoff that a lot of them, but not all of them, would probably prefer the Big Ten to stay away from ESPN and how they feel about what happened last year. But I don't know. I don't know if I buy Florida having the veto power that they denied they had today. Their athletic director actually commented on it, but that was one of those. Is that a political statement that he knows he can say right now because he thinks Florida State's going to the Big Ten? Or is that the SEC responding to the rumors of those stories and Brett McMurphy by using him to send a message that it's not off the table? Like, are they negotiating, it's Kennedy with Khrushchev and boats in the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Well, I mean, that's what we'll see. Because, I mean, yeah, let's look at if the SEC does decide, okay, we will go ahead and add one school to Florida, or from another school from Florida. I feel like if they had their choice, I kind of feel like it would be Florida State over Miami.
I would be stunned if it was the other way, but pleasantly surprised, I guess, but stunned.
So, but what bodes in Miami's favor is that Florida State is more likely to the Big Ten, although I feel like Miami maybe has a better case for the Big Ten as well. And so if Florida State goes there, and let's say they take Clemson with them, they're tapped out at 20. Hypothetically, I don't know how big they want to get, but that's a number that's thrown out there. Do you think then that with Florida State going the other way, that's going to improve Miami's chances, or what do you think has to happen to see Miami get that invite to the SEC?
The thing with that conference is really, what's the opportunity? They don't need to do a thing, right? But what do they want to do to be aggressive? SEC's already established their position, but you still don't ever want to take that position for granted, right? And where do you think everything is going to be in 3 or 4 or 5 years, or 10 years down the road? Everyone has had their different takes on super conferences, but and I'm not really like in that conversation because if it happens, it happens. If it doesn't, it doesn't. So it's going to be a number of years away. But if that model or some alignment, we're going into a world where ESPN and Fox and Discovery are jointly working on a streaming app gathering all the sports, right? So does it really even matter what you call it if they just want all the best cards in their decks and in their two prime properties? They, right now those two entities split the Big 12, right, with the new deal that's coming up, where they're both involved with them, but they're not so much that way. They don't overlap when it comes to the SEC or the Big 10. But ultimately, you want to have all the brands together. And I can imagine whenever Sankey talks, I just don't know what to believe, right? Like he holds his cards close, and then he makes the moves that you kind of expected would happen if you had the power base that he does ultimately. So we shall see. I don't know the scenario. I think it definitely starts with Florida State going to the Big Ten, and then for some reason not taking Clemson, because then you reset the chessboard. And if you are going to expand, who's available? And I know that there's the conversations about they want more states. They want to get the coverage in North Carolina and Virginia, the contiguous states going. But there's actually no planet where even Miami's had a bunch of down years. But if you look at the TV ratings, you can make an argument that Miami's floor has been established after a number of years of being bad, and there's upside. Virginia and North Carolina on the football side, not the basketball side. Clearly, North Carolina is a premier brand, and if that tips the scales in any way, it's a different conversation. But if you're just focusing on football, you can make the argument that that's not the wisest play. If you believe that college basketball is going to take monumental steps as well, both men's and women's, and then you're going to really want to, it makes even more sense for the SEC to do their next strategy of going after North Carolina and Virginia, which has been rumored a bunch to get those, flagship schools in those two states.
Yeah, you're right. It does seem like that's kind of the way things are going to shake out, which which brings us to, I guess, a scenario which, you asked me a month ago was not one that I would have lent much credence to, but now it seems like, I'm not saying it's the odds-on favorite, but it's seeming more and more possible that Miami could, if the ACC goes, implodes, that a likely home for them could be the Big 12. And again, that's not something I really took seriously, even just a few weeks ago, a month ago. But now, again, it depends on how big the Big Ten and the SEC really want to go. But
Right.
Miami, which is crazy to me, because you look at all these brands, and Miami kind of, as I already kind of said earlier, kind of has a little bit of everything in terms of academics, market, brand, um, ability to compete in both football and basketball. Whereas you look at Clemson, maybe because they don't have the AAU, or you look at UNC, UVA, not as strong in football. All these other schools have, they're really great, but whereas Miami kind of has all that, but yet somehow could, because of the way, everything's being positioned, see itself on the outside of those Super 2 conferences. But I really do think that the floor for Miami would be the Big 12. Of course, there's always independence, but I don't know if that's viable. I guess that's a separate question too. But so what would Miami fans, how would they react if they somehow missed out on those others and found themselves in the Big 12?
I have a two-part answer, because the wrong answer is not intended to be a disrespect thing. I think Miami fans in general would look at the Big 12, without talking about Miami being in it, as a deeper, conference overall in football with some really great schools that is better than the bottom portion of the ACC on the football side. So I think that's would be especially with the entry of the new schools from Utah and Arizona State, Brigham Young, who Miami hasn't played in a while but has played in the past. I think there's respect for the program.
I remember old footage of some of those games.
Yeah, the games definitely exist. I don't remember how long ago it was. I don't think I was there, but I know because I've looked this up in the recent conversations. When both were independent, right? Probably is when it came along. So I think there's a respect for the program. I think that for the conference. In a world where Jim Phillips is your commissioner, there's definitely envy of looking at Big 12 commissioner making moves and saving the conference. However, I think that most Miami fans would be apocalyptic if the Big 12 happened, and not because more towards directed about being the fact that that happened because of years of neglect of the program and not making bad decisions in terms of hiring coaches incorrectly, not resourcing it correctly. Though the U logo that is associated with Miami football that's behind me was created by the athletic department, right? It became the symbol for the school. It wasn't the school. The athletic department took it from the school. It then got slapped on to the hospital system that Miami absorbed a number of years ago and is now doing quite well with in terms of the financial money that's spinning off of that. And then finally, it was just the right time that everyone got it together that we have to invest in the brand. And whether it works out or not, we shall see. Hiring Mario Cristobal, who's an amazing recruiter and doing fantastic in the NIL, hasn't yet delivered on the field, but there's a lot of optimism for this year as we call it, this is lying season, right? We're all lying about how things are going to be great. And by September 15th, we'll know how we feel about what we were talking about all spring. But there's a lot of optimism there, like from the fans themselves to what's going on. But I think there would be vitriol directed internally about the moves that made what, if you go back 10 years ago, even when Miami had a number of bad years, I don't think if the same scenario had been playing out at the same time, there'd even be a question about it, right? It's a lot about the last several years not getting the program where it needs to be. I don't know that's a great cultural fit just because of the nature of the schools. It's neither geographically great or aligned in some of that where the students are coming from, like the Big Ten. So there's that. I think it would be a lot of awesome road trips for sure. But it's a hike. It's a really big hike for everyone, and it's a great game road trip for all the schools that are in the Big 12 who are in much closer proximity. UCF, right? UCF isn't really considered a rival for Miami fans. Like, we wouldn't want to lose to them, but it's not like little brother. It's like little concern at this point. But that will probably change as that program continues to grow and we stop mocking their big national championship rings from a number of years ago. But yeah, that's probably the take. I don't know that it's the worst world, and I could, if everything went really on different paths than people expect, maybe that's a possibility. I would have to know what is the implosion that actually happens in the ACC, right? And even if Clemson and Florida State leave, like, who's left? Because then you get to this place of, well, how much difference is the value and the dollar amount between this media contract and that media contract, and versus the travel difference, or when there are away games, sure, we'll probably get people in the seats there because we have fans all over the place, but we'll probably have more road visitors closer to us in that case, because it's not Los Angeles or Chicago. Not that there aren't plenty in Arizona or in Salt Lake. There are plenty, but it's still a private institution, alumni base. So, that, I think you'd have to see exactly what the quote unquote ACC implosion is. Full on ACC is gone. Sure, I'm sure that's what will happen. If it's all the Tobacco Road schools still and bringing a couple more schools in, then I think it's really a math equation, and probably to some degree where people feel the fit is on there. You can make an argument you probably get treated better even in that scenario by coming in as a major brand into the Big 12. I could just imagine that would actually be the case in reality, even if in theory you might still be the biggest brand left in the ACC, at least on the football side. I'm not going to overshadow UNC or Duke on the basketball side, but it would definitely be interesting. I would invite, if that starts to happen or rumored, get your censorship stuff on and check out Miami Boards. It would probably be a very interesting read, but I definitely keep it with your words ready.
No, I mean, that's what you were being very politically correct at the beginning of your statement. But no, I agree. I could see Miami fans not really being thrilled by that, and it makes sense, especially when your two major in-state rivals would be in some of these quote unquote super conferences or these major conferences going forward. And so it would feel like being left behind. Now, if it were like, which this isn't happening, but like Florida State and Miami to the Big 12, I think then it would be more palatable because you're not being left behind by yourself. You're being left behind with another rival. And I get that. If BYU had to, if the Big 12 fell apart and then BYU went to, back to the Mountain West. Well, no, that's a bad analogy.
That's not a good example. I don't think it's as much of a trip. It's probably more just why did we let ourselves get in that position? That became a question. But in that specific scenario, let's say Miami hasn't been, hey, we tried to get everything going and we reinvested hundreds of millions of dollars, literally, from coaching staffs to facilities to NIL programs to probably paying the top rev share that they're going to be allowed to pay under the new settlement, whatever the hell that is, and however they wind up breaking that out. You're still going to be recruiting your hotbed. The people who are recruiting there will now be your main rivals in the perception of the two best conferences, right? And then it might become an issue of like, sure, I can match your NIL, but I have 4 teams that are going to go to the college football playoff this year, and you're going to play in these stadiums, and you're closer. You're not living in Miami, but all of your games are closer for your parents or family. It's a different thing. It's not that, oh, it wouldn't be awesome to go play Utah, or let's go, let's go to Phoenix. It would be cool to, play against Arizona State if they get their program together, or all the different schools that would be an opportunity. The first time you get to go to Oklahoma State and see what that's like. It's more of what is the impact to your program and your recruiting base when your key rivals wouldn't be next to you. And then how much money is that differential worth versus the ACC? But again, the same question would come into play if you're the last one left there. The big fish, small pond kind of model there.
Yeah, and like you said, it kind of depends on what kind of ACC implosion, because there's, I think, a realistic, I don't know what the odds are, but a realistic chance that only Florida State and Clemson leave. I think we can all assume that at this point, those two schools will be gone, whether it's by next season or in a couple years, whatever. At some point, they will be out of the conference. But Absolutely. If everybody else is behind, and maybe you add 1 or 2 to try to replace them, I think it makes sense for Miami to stay. If the payout, if the financials are similar between the two conferences, I wouldn't think it makes sense. I think it does make sense to stay more regional, even if Miami, although I do think this is an interesting wrinkle, even if Miami is not completely in love with the ACC, it may make sense to continue with those existing rivalries and a little bit more geographic footprint. Even though Big 12 does have some, former conference mates of Miami. I don't know how strong those rivalries have really were at that time, like West Virginia or Cincy.
West Virginia was a good rivalry. I don't know that Cincinnati would ever have been considered in that a clear gap between West Virginia and Cincinnati in terms of like the history with Miami, regardless if somebody told me that we played them the same amount of times. I can just tell you, I took a road trip to West Virginia in my time. I can't remember playing Cincinnati. That's no disrespect to the program. It's just more of a recall off the top of my head. And, I still believe that the ACC is going to fairly implode where the top 7 or 8. It may not be all in one fell swoop, depending upon what happens with settlements and costs for the lawsuits and what Florida State and Clemson do in those timelines. But the interesting wrinkle that, sort of surfaced in the last week or two too, which is what is going on in the state of North Carolina generally, right? In terms of North Carolina wanting to lead, does NC State have to go with them? What's going on with the board of trustees and their board of governors? And there was, I was with Bomber, who's, runs the channel for College Football Mafia. And we had a guest who's an economics and public policy professor who was basically stating that as much as North Carolina would be risking not getting by not making a move to the Big Ten or SEC if that was there, from an economic perspective, the tourism board and having all 4 of those schools on Tobacco Road and the events they host and the people coming in and keeping even internal travel for Wake Forest fans going and doing an overnighter to Chapel Hill or whatever it might be, that economic impact that could be lost might override the economic upside that UNC Chapel Hill, as an example, could get. So I could, whereas I would have said the other day, I'm pretty sure when it's all said and done, the Louisville, Pittsburgh, well, maybe Pittsburgh, Louisville, Miami, North Carolina State, Clemson, Syracuse, Virginia Tech are all going to be gone, and they'll be splintered among those three. I at least have a question in my mind when it's all said and done. And who knows, maybe the North Carolina schools just stay with the ones who wouldn't get a place, like Boston College, and they pull others, and the others still leave. I think the main thing really there ultimately, which might be more important than whether Florida State and Clemson leave, because they're going to leave, is what does ESPN really do, and what is the impact of, do they keep that contract? Is the contract really through 2036 versus 2027? It's a massive linchpin that we don't know today, but we will know by February 1st of next year. So in some form, even if there's, that might be season 3 of this for the ACC.
Okay. So, yeah, it's very interesting. There's so many unknowns. And so, I mean, nobody, no matter how much they claim to know or be an insider, nobody knows at this point. I wonder if Greg Sankey even knows, how this is going to play out. Although I'm sure he has a much better idea than us, but obviously. So, I didn't ask you this ahead of time, so I'm going to put you on the spot, but if you had to put odds on where Miami is, let's say in 5 years, between SEC, Big Ten, ACC, whether existing or rebuilt, Big 12, or other, whatever that other may be, where would you put the odds on where Miami ends up?
My gut, if you're giving me a 5-year time frame, which is super kind and easier for me to say something with more degree of informed guessing confidence, which doesn't make any sense, of course, but if you give me that time frame, which basically means you're getting to another cycle of SEC contracts being negotiated, another cycle of Big 12 contracts being negotiated, and another cycle of Big 10 contracts negotiated, and probably not another cycle of ACC conference being negotiated, but maybe because those two schools leave and ESPN changes the parameters of the deal, I would say today, 3 months from now, I'll change my mind. We need to do a football pool for all of this stuff, right? Like it's the NCAA brackets, put it in and give points for right picks over 2 or 5 years and add it all up, and whoever's around in 5 years can get the pile of cash. I would still go 70-75% for the Big Ten, 10% for 10% SEC, 10% Big 12, 5% ACC. That would be my guess.
Interesting.
I don't believe that the ACC is going to stick with the Miami's going to stick there ultimately. There's a lot of people who talk about the Miami president. I don't believe the Miami president, who may have been lukewarm about going through this stuff at one point, is even going to be the Miami president after next year when Miami celebrates its centennial. That's not what people that I know believe is likely to happen. So I don't think that the president's really involved in the decision, though there are some smart people who think that. I know there are people out there who think that the ACC will realign into more of a academic schools who actually play Division I sports, the Notre Dames, the Dukes, North Carolina, Stanfords, and that could be a play, and could be, and that wouldn't shock me either. But with all the information that I absorb and not enough access to the real information, that would be my guess.
Wow. All right. So in this scenario, you're saying that the Big Ten likely expands beyond 20 teams.
I'm not 100%, even though I believe in people that Clemson is definitely, and Florida State are definitely going to the Big Ten, though I think it's extremely likely, and I believe a lot of the information that people out there have, so I'm not disputing that. But I also believe that negotiations in public and people going through reporters to say things often are accurate, and there are almost as often a smokescreen for other things and negotiating ploys. So maybe I believe Florida State to the Big Ten, Clemson I'm less sure about. But yes, in theory, if those two are true, then I am of the mindset that the Big Ten would go there, but not just because to that number of schools, but not just because I need that, because Miami would theoretically be school 21. In my head, I've always thought that at some point that they would go to 20. I always think it's 20 or 24, not 22, just from like a scheduling perspective. There's things out there that make it easier to go back to divisions and stuff like that if you go to 24. But even though they're moved away from that for this year, but things change all the time. Because there's just the perception of, hey, it's a tough media market. It's a tough media market today. It's also not a down media market. The NBA just enters the chat and waves high, right? Like there's never been a down round in major sports in the United States for any conference that wasn't imploding or lost all of their key members, or any major sport. The only one that I know of that was sort of weird is there was this thing with the NHL in a contract, a couple of decades ago, where they did a revenue share model and they basically got like wiped off the face of the earth with how that deal was structured. But for the most part, sports deals have always gone up, and right now the only things that go up and have the traction and probably won't be going away in 3 or 4 years, despite the Netflix is entering, are sports rights. So I don't believe, this is leaning more into my history of like IP and proper and rights and media deals. I don't believe that in 2029 or 2030, to the degree that we know anything, because Lord knows I didn't know what the hell was going to happen 5 years ago over the last 5 years. I don't believe that there's an automatic assumption that the sports rights won't continue to grow up. I think if I had to bet money, I think they will continue to go, whether it's the same doubling or 40% thing up over time. I don't know. So I do think there's a world where the Big Ten goes to 24 because Fox wants them to go to 24.
Yeah, it's very likely. All those conversations are being had, and that they have some sort of tentative plan, at least in the works. And like you said, sports, that's the one thing that really drives viewership. Well, live viewership, right. Live TV is sports, because it doesn't really work on reruns or binging later, down the road. You got to watch it, consume it live. So it's not going anywhere. So excellent. Well, this has been a lot of fun, a lot of great insights on Miami. I learned a lot on that point of view from the Hurricanes down there. And so appreciate it very much. Rock and Rant, tell us how everyone can follow you and any of your content.
Sure. You can follow me at the same screen name on Twitter or X, whichever one you choose to call it. And on occasion, it is Twitter for me, and it's not old guy. It's just, I don't like, X just doesn't work for me. But anyway, whatever works for you, that's where I'll be. That's where you can find me. And I also contribute to the College Football Mafia crew, who have a channel on YouTube that focuses a lot on realignment as well. I'm sure many of you have encountered it. If not, that's how I actually got connected through to Trevor, which I appreciate having the opportunity to join you on the show today. And I also kind of help run the Discord for the CFB Mafia. So if you're looking for ways to engage with people about this content on the realignment, but also the EA game side and other things, when the actual games finally start to play again, which I think we'll all be looking forward to after learning way too much about lawsuits and bylaws over the last 6 months, it's a great place to join, and I'll just have my popcorn ready to watch you and your friends at Utah have a holy war and dive into that.
I only have a couple friends at Utah, so but
we all have to be nice. I'm sure you do. I have a friend at Florida State.
See, it can be done. My dad's actually Ute, so it's all right. We all have flaws. We all have family secrets. But anyway, Rock and Rant, thank you so much for joining me. Enjoy LA and the sun down there. You're obviously looking much more tan than I am on this video, so I need to work on that. But appreciate it.
It's also bad lighting and at dusk here, so I have to invest in the lamp that you have in front of you.
All right. Well, thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Bye.